Welcome back, wanderers. Welcome back to another long night of lore, another slow drift into the deeper currents of a world that rewards patience, curiosity, and a willingness to sit with tragedy for a while. If you're here for the first time, you've arrived at a good place. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let the world outside go quiet. Because tonight we're going somewhere important, somewhere that sits at the very edge of existence, where time itself has run out of places to go, and where one of the most profoundly affecting characters in the history of video games has been waiting for us. Tonight we're talking about Slave Knight Gael. His full name in the game is simply that. Slave Knight Gael. No grand title, no kingdom to his name. And that simplicity is itself a kind of statement, a declaration of origins that most people in the world of Dark Souls would rather forget. Slave knights were not supposed to be remembered. They were not supposed to have stories. They were tools, instruments of war designed to be used and discarded. They wore their red hoods like a brand, like a mark of condemnation stamped on them by a civilization that needed their bodies but did not value their souls. They bled and broke and went mad on battlefields whose names have been scrubbed from history, fighting wars whose outcomes no longer matter in a world already sliding toward its final sunset. And yet here we are, talking about one of them. At length, with reverence. There is something deeply satisfying about that. Gael's story is not the story of a chosen hero. It is not the story of divine destiny or prophesied greatness. He was never selected by the gods for some sacred purpose. He was never granted visions of his fate or blessed with supernatural power at birth. When we meet him for the first time in Dark Souls III, kneeling in quiet prayer in the Cathedral of the Deep, he is simply a very old, very tired man who has decided that someone he loves needs help, and that he is going to do whatever it takes to provide it. That's all. That's the seed of everything that follows. But what follows from that seed is extraordinary. Over the course of this video, we are going to walk every step of Gael's journey together, from his origins as an expendable undead soldier in the wars of the Age of Fire, through his transformation into a guardian and a seeker of salvation, all the way to that ash-covered wasteland at the end of time where his story reaches its devastating, beautiful conclusion. We are going to look closely at his weapons and his armor, the lore embedded in every piece of his equipment. We are going to explore the painted world he called home, the young painter whose needs set him on his impossible quest, and the cosmic forces he chose to grapple with in her service. We are going to understand what the Dark Soul actually is, why it matters, and what it costs to carry it. And then we are going to sit with the meaning of all of it for a while, because Gael's story, at its heart, is not really about the mechanics of Dark Souls lore. It is about what people are willing to sacrifice for the ones they love. It is about what it means to retain your humanity when the world is systematically trying to strip it away. It is about hope. Stubborn, unreasonable, extraordinary hope, persisting in the most hopeless of circumstances. So settle in. We have a long way to travel tonight, and the journey is worth every step. To understand Gael, truly understand him, you have to understand what he was before the quest, before the painted world, before any of the grand gestures of sacrifice that define his legend. You have to understand what it meant to be a slave knight. And that understanding requires spending some time with a kind of cruelty that the world of Dark Souls tends to keep just out of frame, implied rather than stated, visible only in the descriptions of old armor and forgotten weapons. The slave knights were a military institution of the Age of Fire. They were not a knightly order in any traditional sense, not a brotherhood bound together by shared oaths and noble ideals, not warriors who had chosen their path from among a range of honorable options. They were something closer to a forced labor force of the permanently damned. The most critical piece of information about them comes from the slave knight set description, which tells us that these warriors were undead soldiers sent into the worst of the worst situations, designated as cannon fodder in the bleakest of battles, so that living soldiers whose lives were considered worth preserving, could be kept out of harm's way. Think about the logic of that arrangement for a moment. In a world where the undead curse causes those afflicted to rise from death and continue existing, Even after their bodies have been horribly damaged, you have a resource that conventional military thinking can barely help but exploit. Living soldiers die permanently. You can only spend them once, but undead soldiers can die and get back up, die again, get back up again. They are, in a purely mechanical sense, reusable. Send them into the meat grinder. Let the enemy exhaust their weapons and their energy on these bodies that keep coming. Save your real troops for the battles that matter. The Slave Knight's set description does not mince words about what this meant for the individuals pressed into this service. They grew decrepit, their skin charred black and their bones twisted. Eventually, they went outright mad but were never relieved from duty. Never relieved from duty. Sit with that phrase. Imagine what it describes. Battle after battle, death after death. Not the merciful finality of true death, but the ongoing horror of resurrection into a body that is increasingly broken, increasingly beyond repair. You die and come back and your bones haven't healed right. You die and come back and there is a burn across half your face that will never fade. You die and come back and something in the wiring of your mind has come slightly loose, slightly further from what it once was, slightly closer to the hollow emptiness that waits at the end of the undead experience. And then you are sent back to the front, because you are not a person anymore. You are a resource. You are a tool. You serve until you cannot serve. And then you continue to serve anyway. The red hoods that slave knights wore were their most visible identifier, and the item description tells us these hoods signified their condemned status. The word condemned is important here. These were not simply soldiers in difficult circumstances. They were people who had been officially, formally, institutionally categorized as expendable. The hood was a public announcement of their social standing, or rather, of their complete lack of it. When you saw the red hood, you knew this person's life has been assessed and found to be worth nothing except as a buffer against enemy attacks. And yet the item description offers that strange, almost cruel detail. The fine craftsmanship made this a symbol of honor. The armor issued to slave knights was well made, high-quality materials, careful construction. This is the surface-level story, the official narrative that allowed the institution to present itself as something other than what it was. We honor these warriors. We give them fine gear. Never mind that we send them to die endlessly in battles where they cannot possibly win, where their deaths are the entire point, where their suffering is not a regrettable side effect, but the intended function of their role. This gap between the official narrative and the experienced reality is one of the most quietly damning pieces of commentary in all of Dark Souls lore. The fine armor is there to give the institution a face it can present to itself. The actual experience of wearing it is one of unending horror. What does this create in the people who survive it? The armor description tells us most slave knights went mad. The accumulated trauma of endless death and resurrection, the progressive physical deterioration, the complete absence of any prospect of rest or release. All of this, for most people, leads to the hollow madness that Dark Souls treats as a kind of default fate for those who cannot hold on to their sense of self. They become shells. They stop being people and start being things. Weapons with no wielder, violence with no purpose. Most of them, not all, Gael endured. And that endurance is not a small thing. It is not simply a matter of being tough, of having higher stats than his fellow slave knights, of being built different in some crude physical sense. The kind of endurance required to maintain your humanity, your genuine personhood, through what the slave knights experienced is something far deeper and rarer than physical resilience. It is a kind of spiritual stubbornness, a refusal, absolute and unreasoning, to let the machinery of dehumanization complete its work. We don't know what kept him going during those early centuries. The lore doesn't give us that directly, and perhaps that is appropriate. The reasons people hold on to themselves in impossible circumstances are often private, ineffable, resistant to neat summary. Maybe he had something he loved. Maybe he had something he believed in. Maybe it was pure, blind, animal determination, the kind that does not ask why and does not answer to despair. Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. When his brothers went hollow, Gael remained. When their names were forgotten along with the wars they fought, something in Gael persisted that remembered what it was. The repeating crossbow that becomes one of his signature weapons in his final battle carries within its description a fascinating piece of evidence about his psychological state during those years. The description tells us it was customized for repeat firing to face mobs alone, modified to allow a single fighter to suppress large numbers of enemies without the need for allies or support. This is not a standard military weapon. This is something you create when you have deeply internalized the reality that you will often be fighting alone, often be outnumbered, and need to maximize your ability to keep enemies at bay through rate of fire rather than precision. It speaks to tactical intelligence. Yes, Gael was clearly a thinker, even under the worst circumstances. But it also speaks to something more poignant, a refusal to simply accept death as inevitable. He modified his equipment. He adapted. He found ways to improve his odds in situations where the entire point was that he had no odds worth improving. This is who Gael is, at the foundation. Not a born hero. Not a divinely blessed champion. A survivor who refused to stop surviving, and who retained, through all of it, the capacity to care about something other than his own continuation. That capacity is what made everything else possible. The wars that created and sustained the institution of slave knighthood did not exist in isolation. They were expressions of something deeply embedded in the structure of the world that Gwyn built, a civilization that was, at its core, founded on the exploitation of the undead and the denial of what the dark soul represented. To fully appreciate the world that made Gael what he was, we need to spend some time understanding that world and its fundamental contradictions. The Age of Fire began with one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the Dark Souls universe. When Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, discovered the power of the First Flame and used it to overthrow the Age of Ancients, he established an order built entirely around the flame's primacy. The gods held their power because they held fire. The world was structured around the assumption that fire was the natural and proper state of things, that the flame should be maintained, linked, sustained against the darkness that would naturally follow its fading. Everything in Gwyn's civilization was organized around this principle. The problem, the deep, systemic problem that the Age of Fire never solved and never could solve, is that this premise was false. Fire fades. The flame is not eternal. The Age of Fire was not the natural state of things but an interruption of a cycle, an artificially extended period of light maintained through increasingly desperate measures. Gwyn's willingness to burn away his own soul, to link the fire, and buy a few more ages' worth of light, is the most famous expression of this desperation, but it was far from the only one. The entire civilization he built was oriented around the same fundamental denial, that the dark which follows fire is not an ending to be feared but a natural phase to be accepted, that humanity's inheritance of the dark soul is not a threat to be contained but a transformation to be allowed. Instead, Gwyn feared it. And from that fear came the wars. And from the wars came the need for cannon fodder. And from the need for cannon fodder came the institution of slave knighthood. The specific wars that slave knights fought in are not named in the law. History has been conveniently stripped of these details, which is itself a kind of evidence. When civilizations erase the records of their worst behaviors, they do it for a reason. What we can infer is that these were often wars against enemies that conventional armies could not easily defeat. Enemies resistant to death. Enemies numerous enough that individual casualties on the god-aligned side would be prohibitively costly. Situations where the practical solution was to throw undead soldiers at the problem until it went away. The slave knights served as shock troops, as bait, as sacrificial vanguards sent ahead to absorb the worst of the enemy's attention, while the forces that actually mattered positioned themselves for decisive action. The sunset shield that Gael carries is one of the more enigmatic pieces of his equipment, and it opens a window into a possible earlier period of his existence that predates his time as a slave knight. The shield is described as belonging to the Holy Knights of the Sunless Realms, an order whose exact nature and location remain subjects of scholarly debate in the Dark Souls community, with some identifying these sunless realms as Ulasil, others proposing Anor Lundo in its decline, others still suggesting they might be the Painted Worlds themselves. The description notes that the shield was designed for those who both harbor and oppose the power of flame, a remarkable duality that speaks to a complex ambivalent relationship with the very force that defined Gwyn's civilization. If Gael once served in this order, if this shield is genuinely his, and not simply something acquired in battle, then his history is even richer than a simple narrative of slave knight servitude would suggest. He may have been, at some earlier point, a warrior in a more honored capacity, someone who grappled philosophically and practically with fire's place in the order of things. The harboring and opposing duality in the shield's description would prove prophetic of his entire story. He was, in a very real sense, someone who served fire's cause, while the circumstances of that service were actively working to extinguish everything human in him. The canvas talisman that he carries reinforces this picture of a man with genuine faith, not the institutional piety of someone performing religious obligation, but the quiet, sincere prayer of a wanderer who reaches out to forces beyond himself, not for power but for guidance. The talisman is described as belonging to traveling clerics and pilgrims, not priests with established positions in the religious hierarchy, but people on the move, people who have chosen the uncertain path and ask for company along the way. That Gael chooses this simple, unadorned version of a faith implement rather than something more ornate or powerful tells us something about his character. He is not a man who seeks to impress anyone with his piety, not even himself. The executioner's greatsword is perhaps the most complex piece of his equipment in terms of lore implications. It is described as a beheading sword used for executions, and whether Gael was the executioner who originally wielded it or whether he took it from some fallen warrior during his centuries of service, the fact that he carried it for so long means something. This is a weapon designed for a specific, grim, necessary task in a functional society. The ending of condemned lives, the Zyme, that Gael, himself condemned, would carry the instrument of condemnation is either profoundly ironic or perfectly appropriate, depending on how you read his relationship to the institution that made him what he was. The blade, the description tells us, has been greatly nicked and stained with blood and dark due to its long history of battle. That stain of dark is significant. Dark in the Dark Souls universe is not simply a visual descriptor. It is a physical manifestation of the soul's essence, of humanity's fundamental nature. A weapon stained with dark has been in contact with something deeper than ordinary blood, something that touches the soul directly. That Gael's weapon carries this stain even before his ultimate transformation suggests that his long association with the undead, his long years of fighting in the darkest of circumstances, had already begun to draw him toward the power that would eventually consume him. The Age of Fire's dirty secret, then, is this. It was built on the backs of people it had categorized as not really people anymore. It extracted from them centuries of service, broke their bodies, fractured their minds, and then erased the records of what had been done to them. The fine armor was a decoration on a fundamentally exploitative institution, the honor a story told to make the horror bearable for those administering it rather than those experiencing it. Gael came from this. He was shaped by it, hardened by it, and somehow not destroyed by it. And when he finally walked away from it, when he found his way to a painted world where someone needed him for reasons that had nothing to do with his expendability, he carried all of that history with him. Every scar, every nick in the blade, every layer of rust on the crossbow. He carried the weight of everything he had survived, and he used it. The determination it had forged in him, the tactical intelligence it had developed, the stubborn refusal to accept despair that it had somehow produced rather than destroyed, to pursue the most unlikely and extraordinary act of love in the Dark Souls universe. There is a way of doing Dark Souls lore analysis that treats the items as mere flavor text, supplementary color, added to a narrative that exists elsewhere. This approach misses something essential about how From Software tells stories. In Dark Souls, the items are the story. The descriptions embedded in weapons and armor and rings and spells are not decoration. They are primary sources, fragments of historical record, scattered across a world whose official histories have been suppressed or destroyed. Reading them carefully, reading them in relation to each other, and to the character who carries them, is one of the most rewarding acts of attention you can perform in these games. Gael's equipment, taken together, reads like a compressed autobiography. Let's start with the repeating crossbow, since it tells us the most specific things about his psychology during the slave night years. The description notes it was customized for repeat firing to face mobs alone, and that it has been used in the battles of an endless journey, covered with twists and dinks, rusted with blood, and made extremely brittle from overuse. Every detail here is meaningful. The customization tells us he is a thinker who adapts. The coverage of damage tells us he has actually used this thing extensively in genuine life or death situations, not simply carried it as a backup. The brittleness from overuse is particularly poignant. This weapon is, at the time of his final battle, on the verge of simply falling apart in his hands. It has been pushed far beyond its intended operational lifespan. There is something almost heartbreaking about a weapon made brittle from overuse. It implies not just hard use, but desperate use. Someone who could not afford to swap out their equipment, who had to keep going with what they had, because there was no opportunity and perhaps no means to replace it. The crossbow is a portrait of someone making do, of extended service under conditions where the luxury of properly maintaining your kit simply was not available. It suggests years, perhaps centuries, of continuous campaigning without the breaks and resupply periods that proper armies receive as a matter of course. Slave knights did not get rest periods. They did not get resupply. They fought until they couldn't fight anymore. And the condition of Gael's crossbow reflects that reality. The weapon skill associated with this crossbow in gameplay is called Rain of Bolts, a barrage of projectiles released in rapid sequence, designed not for precise individual targeting, but for suppressive fire against multiple enemies simultaneously. This is the tactical philosophy of someone who has deeply internalized the reality of being outnumbered. When you are one person facing a crowd, you cannot pick off individual enemies carefully and deliberately. You need to create chaos, to force the crowd to deal with projectiles coming from multiple angles, to buy yourself breathing room and repositioning opportunities. This is the strategy of survival under impossible odds. Not the elegant swordsmanship of a trained duelist, but the desperate pragmatism of someone who has learned through bloody experience how to still be breathing at the end of a fight when the odds were dramatically against them. The executioner's greatsword carries a different kind of story. Where the crossbow speaks to pragmatic adaptation, the sword speaks to the weight of history and the way objects accumulate meaning through long association. The item description tells us it was originally a beheading sword for executions, and that it has been greatly nicked and stained from long service in battle. The transformation from judicial implement to battlefield weapon is itself a kind of law. At some point, this sword passed from the ordered world of formal execution into the chaotic world of open combat. Whether Gael was the executioner who made that transition, or whether he acquired the blade later, what matters is that he has kept it. Through all his years of wandering, through all the opportunities he would have had to acquire better, newer, less damaged equipment. He held on to this sword. People hold on to old weapons for many reasons. Sentiment sometimes. Practical familiarity, knowing a weapon's balance and weight so thoroughly that you trust it over anything new. Or perhaps something harder to name. The feeling that you and this object have been through enough together that abandoning it would be a kind of betrayal. The sword is stained with dark, as noted, which means it has been in contact with the deepest aspects of the undead experience. It has been present for things that touched the soul itself. That history does not wash off. When Gael's soul is transposed after his defeat, this sword becomes Gael's greatsword, and its weapon skill, Executioner's Charge, reflects the transformation his own nature underwent over the course of his quest. The skill has him cover the blade in red souls, those fragmentary manifestations of absorbed humanity, and launch forward in a devastating rush. This is no longer the controlled, precise act of judicial execution. This is the desperate, all-consuming forward charge of someone who has absorbed the weight of countless lives and channels that accumulated energy into a single violent expression. The executioner has become the executed, in a sense, carrying within himself the essence of all those he could not save, of all the lost and desperate souls whose humanity he absorbed in his attempt to help the painter. The sunset shield is worth dwelling on, because it opens one of the more genuinely puzzling aspects of Gael's equipment. The Sunset Shield is described as belonging to the Holy Knights of the Sunless Realms, an order more closely associated in the game with Cirrus of the Sunless Realms and her grandfather Hodric, whose armor and shield appear directly connected to that order. The shield's description notes that it was designed for those who both harbor and oppose the power of flame, a remarkable duality built into its design philosophy. Why does Gael carry it? The lore offers no direct answer. It could be that the shield was simply acquired during his long travels, a useful piece of kit taken from a fallen warrior without deeper symbolic significance. It could also be, and this is speculative, reading something into the equipment choice that may or may not have been intended, that there is some unspecified connection between Gael and this order, or between his background and the complex relationship with flame that the shield represents. The Sunless Realms themselves are a matter of ongoing debate among the lore community, with some connecting them to Anor in its sunless decline, others to Mirror based on the shield's visual similarity to the Mirror shield from Dark Souls II. What we can say is that the harbor and opposed duality built into the shield's design feels resonant with Gael's whole story. He served a cause built around fire, was used as fuel for fire's wars, and yet worked his entire life toward creating something that transcended the fire and dark binary entirely. Whether the shield was chosen deliberately as a statement of that duality, or simply ended up in his hands by circumstance, it became, in his use of it, an emblem of exactly that contradiction. That phrase, harbor and oppose, is worth sitting with. To harbor flame is to protect it. But to oppose it is to maintain enough critical distance to recognize when the costs of that protection have exceeded what is just. The warrior who can hold both positions simultaneously is not a true believer, not a simple instrument of any institution's agenda. If Gael chose this shield, rather than simply carrying it out of convenience, and we cannot know for certain, that choice could imply a settled relationship with the contradiction at the heart of his entire existence. The canvas talisman completes this picture. In a world full of ornate faith implements belonging to established religious orders, Gael carries the simplest possible version, a plain canvas talisman used by wanderers and pilgrims. This tells us he is not affiliated with any institution's version of faith. He has not received his spirituality from a church or an order. He has carried it himself, alone, on the road, in the way that travelers who have been away from every kind of home for very long eventually develop their own private relationship with whatever forces they believe might be listening. The miracle he uses, Way of White Corona, sends rings of light out to hunt and return. It is a seeking magic, a reaching towards something magic. Even his chosen spell is an expression of his fundamental orientation, going out, searching, returning. This is Gael, assembled from fragments. A man shaped by centuries of thankless service into something improbably intact, carrying his history in the condition of his weapons and the worn surface of his armor, faithful in a wanderer's way to something that had no official name. He is not a hero built for the role he will eventually play. He is a survivor who found a reason worth surviving for. It is not entirely clear from the available lore exactly when Gael found his way to the Painted World of Ariandel, or precisely what sequence of events led him there. What we know is that he found it, and that the finding of it changed everything about the direction of his existence. The Painted Worlds of Dark Souls are one of the most conceptually beautiful ideas in the entire franchise. They are created spaces, worlds that exist within paintings, accessed through the physical artwork that contains them. But they are not simply fancy simulations or pocket dimensions in the way that term implies in other fantasy traditions. They are genuine refuges, places created specifically to house the forlorn, those beings and souls who have no place in the natural order, who have been displaced by the cycles of fire and dark that govern the main world, who exist outside the categories that the established powers recognize and make room for. To be forlorn in the Dark Souls universe is to be a soul for whom the world as constituted has no use and makes no provision. The gods took care of the gods. The humans were managed and categorized and either put to use or set aside. But the beings who fell outside these categories, the Corvians, the strange and twisted creatures who had been shaped by forces outside the normal order, the undead who had been used up and discarded, had nowhere to go. The painted worlds were created for them. They are, in their deepest conception, acts of profound compassion. Someone understood that there were beings who needed a home when the wider world offered none, and used the extraordinary creative power of world painting to make that home for them. Ariandel, when Gael arrives, is already old. The painted world was restored by Father Ariandel, a great Corvian who poured his own blood into the sustaining flame to maintain it, and had served as a refuge for the forlorn for a long time before Friede arrived and complicated matters. But painted worlds age. They are not immune to entropy. The same forces of decay and corruption that afflict the natural world can take hold in a painted world, and when they do, the traditional response has always been to burn the old world away so that a new painter can begin afresh. Fire cleanses. The destruction of the old painting creates the clean slate necessary for the new one. This is the cycle, the natural rhythm of painted world existence. Sister Friede, born Elfried, eldest of the 3 founders of the Sable Church of Lundor, had come to the painted world as an unkindled, an outsider who earned the trust of its forlorn inhabitants over time. Above all, she won the devotion of Father Ariandel, the great Corvian who served as the keeper of the world's sustaining flame, the man who had used his own blood to restore the painting and continued bleeding himself onto the fire to sustain it. Friede convinced Ariandel to stop, to suppress the cleansing burn rather than allow the natural cycle of renewal to proceed. Why she made this choice, the lore leaves productively ambiguous. Perhaps she genuinely believed she was protecting the inhabitants from the disruption of burning and rebirth. Or perhaps she simply could not bear to let go of the world and the power she had found within it. Whatever her reasoning, the effect was clear, a world that continued to rot rather than renew, growing slowly uninhabitable while its inhabitants could do nothing but endure. Into this situation, Gael arrived. The exact nature of how he first made contact with the painter, the young woman whose ability to create new worlds represented the possibility of genuine renewal, is not specified in the lore, but the relationship that developed between them is made clear through the warmth of the painter's references to him. She calls him uncle. In context, this is almost certainly a term of affection rather than any literal blood claim, the kind of familial title that attaches to someone who has been present and caring for long enough that formal titles feel inadequate and wrong. He is not her uncle by biology. He is her uncle because he has been there, reliably and protectively, for the whole of her young life, as she developed her extraordinary gift. Think about what that gift means, and what it must have meant to Gael to be in its presence. She can create worlds. Real worlds, genuine spaces of existence, painted into being with pigment and brush, and the application of concentrated creative intent. She can literally make places where those who have nowhere to go can have somewhere. In a civilization that had spent centuries treating the forlorn as expendable, as resources to be burned up in its wars, here was a young woman whose power was oriented entirely toward creating home for the homeless. For Gael, who understood better than most what it meant to be among the condemned and the forlorn, this must have felt like something close to sacred. The impulse to protect her, to ensure that her gift could be exercised and her safety maintained, would not have required any reasoning. It would have been immediate and absolute. Their relationship, as glimpsed through the painter's words and through the logic of the lore, appears to have been one of genuine mutual affection built over years of quiet coexistence. He fought for her. He provided the security that allowed her to develop her art in peace. She, in turn, gave him what the slave Knight years had never provided, a reason for his continued existence that had nothing to do with being used up. He was not serving her the way the gods had used him. He was choosing, freely, and for his own reasons, to give his protection to someone who needed it. That distinction matters enormously. The difference between servitude and service chosen freely, between the coerced sacrifice of the slave Knight years and the voluntary devotion of someone who has decided this cause, is worth giving himself to. This is the difference between the person Gael was made into and the person Gael chose to be. The crisis in Ariandel, when it became clear that the painted world was continuing to deteriorate and that Sister Friede's intervention could not halt the decay forever, created the moment of decision that would define everything that followed. The world the painter needed to create her masterwork, the world that could serve as a true and lasting home for the forlorn, could not be painted on the existing canvas. Ariandel was too far gone. What was needed was not a restoration but a fresh beginning. A new painting, made with the right materials, capable of being something more than a stopgap measure. The painter understood what pigment she needed. This knowledge came from the deep tradition of painted world creation, from the understanding that worlds of genuine substance and durability required pigment of a very particular kind, something colored like the dark soul of man, something that carried within it the essential nature of humanity's deepest spiritual inheritance. It was when she shared this requirement that Gael understood the scope of what would be necessary, and it was then that he made his decision. The decision to quest for the dark soul was not a dramatic moment of declaration. It did not come with a speech or a ceremony or any of the formal trappings through which great undertakings are usually marked. From what the lore allows us to reconstruct, it was simply a man who loved someone deciding that he was going to find what she needed, regardless of what it cost him. He took a piece of the old painted world with him when he left, a rotted scrap of the original painting, corrupted by the decay that had settled into Ariandel, but still possessed of enough residual power to serve as a door back into the painted world for those who touched it. This was a practical measure and a symbolic one simultaneously. Practically, it would allow him to bring back the allies he might need. Symbolically, it was a piece of the home he was leaving, carried with him, as a reminder of what he was fighting for. Our first encounter with Gael in Dark Souls 3's base game places him in the Cathedral of the Deep, kneeling before a statue next to the cleansing chapel bonfire. The fandom wiki notes this is likely Cather, the goddess associated with tears and sorrow, though some lore analysts suggest it could be Velka, the goddess of sin and mother of the forlorn, whose connection to painted worlds and Corvians runs deep through the series. Either reading fits the moment. Gael is praying to a figure associated with grief, with those who fall outside the accepted order, with the exact category of being his entire quest is oriented towards serving. His prayer: fire for Ariandel and the ash to kindle the flame, tells us the immediate strategic objective. He needs the cleansing fire that Sister Friede and Father Ariandel have been suppressing to be finally released, so that the old world can burn away and the new one can be born. When the Ashen One arrives, Gael's reaction reveals his long experience as a reader of people and situations. He notices immediately something about the Ashen One's nature, the scent, as he describes it, of the same quality he has identified in the Firekeeper. Someone connected to ash, someone who carries within them the capacity to deal with fire in ways that others cannot. He has been searching for this, apparently, for some time. That search has been methodical and informed. He knows what he needs. He knows roughly what it would look or smell like, and he has been patient in his seeking. The trust he extends to the Ashen One in this moment, offering the painting scrap, which is essentially a key to the most sacred place in his existence, to a complete stranger, is striking. It speaks to the combination of desperation and genuine discernment that characterizes his approach throughout this phase of the quest. He is desperate, yes. Ariandel is dying. The painter cannot work without proper conditions, and every delay matters. But he is not reckless. He has made an assessment of the person in front of him and concluded they are trustworthy. His decades of reading people in situations where misreading someone could mean death have given him an accuracy in these judgments that he can rely on. His joy when the Ashen One agrees to help is palpable and unguarded. They of ash never fail, he says, a statement that carries within it both the specific historical observation, those who bear the nature of ash have proven reliable in his experience, and something more personal, the relief of someone who has been carrying an enormous weight alone for a long time, who finally has reason to believe that help is at hand. In the painted world of Ariandel itself, Gael can be summoned to fight alongside the Ashen One against Sister Friede. The contrast between his approach to combat and Friede's is revealing. Friede fights with the cold precision of someone who has suppressed everything human about herself in the service of preservation, every movement calculated, every attack designed to achieve maximum efficiency. Gael fights like someone who has been in too many desperate situations to have the luxury of elegance. Hard, practical, relentless. He does not seek glory in the fight. He seeks the outcome the fight is meant to produce. After Friede's defeat and the burning of Ariandel, the painter explains to the Ashen One what she needs for her new world. Pigment colored like the dark soul of man. Gael's response to this explanation is not recorded in the lore, but we know what he decided to do next. The quest for the dark soul begins in earnest. The Dreg Heap is where we next find evidence of his passage. This bizarre landscape, a compressed accumulation of the ruins of multiple ages, the detritus of civilizations ground together as the world approaches its end, is where Gael has been traveling in his search for the ringed city and the Pygmy Lords who hold what he needs. And characteristically, even while pursuing his own urgent quest, he takes the time to leave guidance for those who might follow him. The phantom messages scattered through the Dreg Heap, marked with what appear to be red skull motifs, are Gael's signposts, careful guidance through treacherous terrain, directions that cost him nothing to leave and could cost someone else their life not to have. This behavior is deeply revealing. A lesser person in his situation, driven by urgency, carrying the weight of an impossible mission, would have no attention to spare for others. Every moment spent on something other than advancing toward his goal is a moment that the painter's world continues to decay, that the forlorn continue to suffer in a dying refuge. He could reasonably justify ignoring everyone and everything except the direct line between himself and the dark soul. But he stops, he notices, he leaves the signs. This is the behavior of someone who has not lost his fundamental orientation toward others, even under extreme duress. The slave night years could have produced a person utterly self-focused, someone who had been forced so completely into the role of expendable resource that they internalized that framing and became unable to see anyone as anything but a resource. Instead, they produced someone whose attention to other people, their struggles, their needs, their situations, remained active and generous even when he had no practical reason to exercise it. The Dreg Heap encounter, where Gael can be summoned to assist against the demon prince, reinforces this picture. He fights with the tactical intelligence we would expect from his long experience, but also with what reads as genuine commitment to a shared victory rather than a demonstration of individual capability. He is a good ally. This is not nothing. Being a good ally under desperate circumstances requires a kind of generosity and perspective that not everyone manages. The red skull motifs that appear in association with him during this phase, around the phantom messages, in the visual language surrounding his presence, are what many lore readers interpret as early signs of a corruption already beginning. If that reading is right, the Dark Soul's influence is reaching toward him even before he actively reaches for it, drawn by his intention and the trajectory of his quest. What's particularly striking about this, if the interpretation holds, is where those signs appear, on acts of kindness. The corruption's fingerprints show up on his most generous gestures first. Whatever is coming hasn't yet reached his behavior. The signs of what will happen decorate things that are still purely good. This is the last stretch of Gael as fully himself. The journey through the Dreg Heap toward the ringed city, toward the Pygmy Lords. He is still recognizably the man who knelt in prayer and offered a stranger his most precious key. He is still the devoted guardian, the careful thinker, the generous wayfarer who leaves signs for those who follow. He is still, in the deepest sense, good. But the ringed city is waiting, and what waits inside it will require something of him that he did not know he had. The ringed city was Gwyn's gift to the Pygmy Lords, and like most of Gwyn's gifts, it was not primarily about generosity. It was about control. Understanding the ringed city requires understanding the relationship between Gwyn and the bearers of the Dark Soul. The furtive Pygmy, humanity's progenitor, had discovered one of the forlorn souls at the first flame, and had made a choice fundamentally different from the choices made by Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, and Nito, where those three used their Lord Souls to establish dominion, to become the ruling powers of a new world organized around their capabilities and inclinations. The furtive Pygmy fragmented the Dark Soul and gave its pieces to his descendants. He chose distribution over concentration. He chose to become the origin of a people rather than the ruler of a civilization. This choice was an act of extraordinary selflessness, and it was also, from Gwyn's perspective, an act of extraordinary threat. The dark soul, distributed among countless human beings as their humanity, that flickering ember of essence that keeps an undead person sane, represented the natural successor to Gwyn's Age of Fire. When the flame faded, as it inevitably would, the Age of Dark would come, and the bearers of the dark soul, humanity collectively, would be the inheritors of the next great age. This was not a theological position that Gwyn found acceptable. His solution was the Ringed City. He summoned the Pygmy Lords, the direct descendants of the furtive pygmy, who carried the largest concentrations of dark soul power, into a specially created realm that existed outside the normal flow of time and causality. He sealed them there, suspended between eras, unable to participate in the world's natural progression. He gave it to them as a gift, with all the architecture of benevolence, a beautiful city, a grand gesture, the language of appreciation, but the purpose was containment. By removing the most powerful bearers of the dark soul from the world's timeline, he delayed the Age of Dark. He preserved his Age of Fire, artificially, against the eventual reckoning. The Pygmy Lords, for their part, appear to have accepted this arrangement with the patient dignity of people who understood what was being done to them, but saw no alternative. They served as their city's faithful guardians for ages beyond counting, maintaining their charge with a dedication that outlasted even their own physical viability. This is what Gael found when he reached the Ringed City. The blood of the dark soul item description gives us the essential information with stark efficiency. When Gael came upon the Pygmy Lords, he discovered their blood had long since dried up. What followed is described in lore summaries as Gael slaughtering the Pygmy Lords and consuming their dried blood in a desperate attempt to take the dark soul for himself, cutting their throats and drinking what remained. The passage of time in their sealed, suspended city had done what time does, not killed them exactly, but aged them beyond any normal endpoint. Their blood, which should have carried the concentrated essence of the dark soul in a form that could be extracted, had become something closer to dust in their veins. The power was technically present. It was simply no longer in a state that could be used for the painter's pigment. For a moment, try to inhabit Gael's experience of that discovery. He has traveled across the world and through time itself. He has fought through the ruins of collapsed ages, navigated landscapes that existed outside the normal rules of geography, sought out every lead, and followed every thread toward this destination. He has been carrying the painter's need like a physical weight, feeling the urgency of it every step of the way, knowing that Ariandel is gone, and that without his success, there is no new home for those who need one. He has endured everything the journey has thrown at him, while maintaining both his focus and his fundamental decency. And now he stands in the Ringed City, having reached his goal, and discovers that the goal is right there in front of him and completely out of reach. The blood exists, in some form, but in its current state, it cannot serve as pigment. It cannot be extracted from the Pygmy Lords as they are. There is no simple solution. We can only speculate about the length of time Gael spent considering his options at this moment, whether the decision that followed was made quickly, in a rush of desperate reasoning, or whether it emerged slowly from hours or days of sitting with the impossibility of his situation. What we know is the decision he arrived at. If he could not extract the blood in its current state, he would take the essence of the dark soul into himself. He would allow his own body to become the vessel in which the dried fragments were reconstituted, transformed by living blood and living will into something new. He would become the dark soul's container. And his blood, his transformed, corrupted, extraordinary blood, would be the pigment the painter needed. The Ashen One's own dark soul item description, obtained after Gael's defeat, tells us that he was aware of the full implications of this choice. He knew he was no champion, that the dark soul would likely ruin him, and that he had little hope of a safe return. These are not the words of someone who made this decision without understanding what it meant. He was fully informed about the probability that this would destroy him, cost him his sanity, transform him into something he would not recognize, and would not have chosen to be. He did it anyway. There is a theological concept in various human traditions of the willing assumption of suffering for the sake of others, the idea that love, at its deepest and most serious, does not step back from cost but steps toward it, that the willingness to bear a burden that should not be yours to bear is one of the most profound expressions of care that a person can make. Gael's choice here is an expression of this principle in the starkest possible terms. He is not sacrificing a comfortable position or a pleasant evening. He is sacrificing himself, his sanity, his humanity, his ability to remain himself. He is offering to become something terrible so that others can find peace. The process of consuming the dried blood of the Pygmy Lords, absorbing the fragments of the dark soul into himself, is described only in the most condensed terms by the item description. The phrase, "and so consumed," carrying all that history in 3 words. But what those words imply is both physically and psychologically horrific. The dark soul is not simply power. It is memory, emotion, desire, the accumulated will of countless human beings concentrated into a spiritual essence. To take that into yourself is not to gain a useful tool. It is to be flooded, to have your own consciousness, your own selfhood, suddenly contending with an overwhelming tide of other experiences, other identities, other lives that are and are not you. Gael absorbed all of it, and he kept going. The transformation that the dark soul's absorption worked on Gael was not instantaneous. It was a process, extended, escalating, progressive, and we can track its stages through the visual language of his appearance and behavior in the final encounter, as well as through the lore of the items associated with him. After devouring the Pygmy Lords and absorbing the essence of the dark soul, Gael's size greatly increases. This is documented in the fandom wiki, directly and visible in the visual transition from the NPC version of Gael to his boss form. His torso becomes larger in comparison to the rest of his body. His armor, according to the game lore, is fused to his flesh by the ever-expanding dark sign, the rusted and cracked plates becoming inseparable from him. The mantle of his armor grows into something wing-like in its proportions. His greatsword loses its tip and part of the fuller, damaged in ways that suggest not combat wear alone but transformation, the weapon changing along with its wielder. The most striking external change was physical. His body grew to accommodate the power pouring into it, expanding beyond human proportions in the way that the bearers of great concentrated soul power often do in Dark Souls. Gael's chest cracked open around what appears to be a massive wound, described in lore sources as akin to a dark sigil, the mark associated with the undead curse. Though unlike the dark sign, this one is not sealed by fire. The hole in his chest, from which the blood of the dark soul will eventually seep, is not an old wound or a symbolic mark. It is the physical consequence of containing power that was never meant to exist within a single being. His flesh, already weathered from long service, warped around the expanding darkness within him. But the physical transformation was secondary to the psychological one. The red skulls that swirl around Gael in his final encounter are one of the most haunting visual elements in all of Dark Souls III. What they represent is left to interpretation. The game provides no explicit caption, but reading them in context of the item descriptions and what we know about the Dark Souls nature, the most compelling interpretation is that each skull represents a soul, or a fragment of one. As Gael consumed the dried blood of the Pygmy Lords and absorbed their dark soul essence, he was not simply receiving a power boost. Based on what we understand about how the dark soul works, how it carries humanity's deepest spiritual inheritance, how it is bound up with the identity and experience of those who bear it, it seems likely that Gael absorbed something of the people themselves, not just an abstract force. The accumulated weight of the Pygmy Lord's existence, the fragmentary essence of the humans who had carried pieces of the dark soul across ages, seems to flow through him as something visible and volatile. Whether those skulls also represent Gael, absorbing the humanity of others nearby, drawing the dark soul fragments that all humans carry toward him, like a kind of spiritual gravity, is more speculative still. The image suggests it. The mechanics of how soul essence works in this universe would support it, but the game doesn't confirm it directly, and it's worth holding that reading lightly. This is the horror at the heart of his transformation. He did not intend to hurt anyone. He set out specifically to help. The process by which his help became possible required him to become something that would inevitably cause harm, not because he wanted to, but because the power involved was too large for any individual container to hold without overflow. He has become a walking catastrophe in the literal sense, an event that absorbs and destroys not from choice but from nature. The mental fragmentation that accompanies this transformation is equally devastating. Gael does not simply gain the Dark Soul's power while remaining himself. He gains it and loses himself simultaneously, becoming progressively less the gentle knight who called the painter my lady, and progressively more a composite of everything the Dark Soul contains. The voices and memories of consumed souls crowd out his own. His individual perspective becomes harder to hold against the flood of absorbed humanity. What makes this tragic rather than simply horrific is that he knew it was coming. He had gone into this with eyes open, aware that the Dark Soul would likely ruin him. He had chosen ruination because the alternative, the painter without her pigment, the forlorn without their sanctuary, was worse. And so he bears the transformation with the same quality that made him Gael in the first place. The stubborn refusal to stop when stopping would be easier. There is a detail in the soul item description that is easy to miss, but profoundly important. After his defeat, his soul is described as containing a viscous, lukewarm lump of gentle humanity. Gentle. That word in that context is almost shocking. After everything we have witnessed of his monstrous final form, after the lightning-wreathed catastrophe of the final encounter, the essence that remains at his core is described as gentle. The corruption was real. The transformation was complete and terrible. But it was overlay, not replacement, somewhere beneath the accumulated weight of absorbed humanity. Beneath the physical monstrosities of his changed form, the gentle knight remained intact. This preservation of his essential character is, in a strange way, the most hopeful and the most heartbreaking thing about him. Hopeful because it suggests that what makes us fundamentally ourselves can survive extraordinary assault. Heartbreaking because it means the person being overwhelmed and obscured by the Dark Soul's corruption was aware, on some level, of what was happening to him, and could not stop it and went through it anyway because the painter needed her pigment. When time itself begins to fracture in the ringed city, when the touch of Filianor's egg shatters the illusion, maintaining the city's suspension outside normal causality, the city does not simply continue to exist in a changed state. It is revealed as what it always was beneath the divine illusion. Ancient, ruined, waiting for the end that has been approaching since the very beginning. What follows the egg's touch is a jump to the world's final moment, the ash desert at the literal end of time, where every civilization that ever existed has been ground to powder by the accumulated weight of ages, where the sky is the color of dying embers, where the wind carries the dust of worlds. This is where we find Gael. He is crouching over the corpses of the last Pygmy Lords, working methodically, extracting whatever final traces of the Dark Soul remain. The image is arresting in the way that true tragedy sometimes is, magnificent and pathetic simultaneously, a being of enormous power performing a task that looks, from outside, like scavenging. He has been at this for a very long time. He will have been at it until he either finished or someone arrived to stop him. When he notices the Ashen One's approach, his first words carry the complex emotional residue of everything he has been through. "Ah, you've come. You found it, have you? The blood of the Dark Soul." There is recognition in this. He knows who the Ashen One is, knows what they carry within them, knows what the meeting means. And there is something that reads as relief, briefly. Here, finally, is someone who can end this. Someone whose presence changes the calculus of the situation from impossibility toward possibility. But he also knows what completing the mission requires. He knows that the blood the painter needs cannot be extracted from him by peaceful means. He knows that for the Ashen One to take what they need, he has to be killed. And the Dark Soul's power, running through him at full saturation, will not allow him to simply offer himself quietly. The compulsion to preserve himself, to continue, is overwhelming. Not because he wants to survive, but because the dark soul as an entity wants to persist, and it is using his body as its instrument. His demand, that thing, your dark soul, for my lady's painting, is simultaneously an expression of his original purpose. He still remembers the painter, still frames everything in terms of what she needs, and an expression of the dark soul's insistence. He needs the fragment of it that the Ashen One carries. He is not asking. He cannot ask anymore. The capacity for negotiation and cooperation has been stripped away by the transformation. He can only demand, and when the demand is not met, he can only attack. This is the final trap his quest has set for him. His love was genuine. His sacrifice was genuine. His intention was never anything but good. And the result is that he has become something that the person who loved him most in the world would not recognize, fighting against the very mechanism that would allow his love to achieve its intended purpose. The battle begins. The encounter with slave Knight Gael is structured in 3 distinct phases, and those phases are not simply a gameplay escalation mechanic. They are a narrative about identity and corruption, about what survives transformation and what doesn't, about the relationship between the person someone was and the thing they became. In the first phase, Gael moves on all 4s. He lunges and snaps. His movements are predatory and animal, driven by the instincts of something that has spent too long in conditions where instinct is more reliable than rational thought. The knight has been submerged. What drives the body now is the accumulated pressure of absorbed humanity, not any particular person's thoughts or strategies, but the raw, undifferentiated drive of a being that has been overloaded with soul stuff and is expending it as pure kinetic aggression. But watch the patterns carefully. Even here, even in this most beast-like presentation, there is structure. The movements follow logical tactical patterns. The positioning is not random. The knight is still in there, buried very deep, and his lifetime of combat experience is still shaping even the most mindless-seeming attacks. The beast moves like Gael. It just doesn't know it anymore. When the Ashen One deals enough damage to begin wearing through the outermost layers of the Dark Soul's influence, the second phase begins, and this is where the encounter becomes genuinely heartbreaking. He stands up, slowly, with effort. Gael rises from the 4-limbed predator posture into something recognizably human. He draws his greatsword with both hands. He begins to use the crossbow in combination with melee attacks. His movement patterns shift from animal instinctive to tactically considered. This is the knight reasserting himself through the damage. The Dark Soul's immediate grip weakened enough for the person underneath to push through. We are fighting, in this phase, something much closer to the Gael who fought alongside us in Ariandel. The methodical, skilled, practically minded warrior who modified his equipment to face impossible odds and left guidance for those who followed. He fights us with the same qualities that made him effective in everything he did: the tactical intelligence, the persistence, the refusal to give up. But he fights us because the task requires that he be fought. The tragedy of this phase is almost unbearable if you understand the context. The closer Gael gets to being himself again, the more effectively he fights against the person who has come to complete his mission. His increasing lucidity is inseparable from his increasing dangerousness. The part of him that was always a good person and a skilled warrior is the hardest part to overcome. The third phase strips away the tactical clarity of the second and replaces it with something else entirely. Raw, apocalyptic power. Lightning falls. The red skulls multiply into a storm. His attacks carry the weight of all of accumulated absorbed humanity. This is not Gael, not the person, not the knight, not the gentle being who called the painter my lady. This is what the Dark Soul looks like when it has fully saturated its vessel and is expressing itself at maximum intensity. And even here, even in this most overwhelming final form, you can see the crossbow, the tattered red cloth, the executioner's blade, the shape of the man who was, visible through the distortion of what he became. When he falls, the silence that follows is one of the most affecting moments in video game history. Not dramatic, not operatic, just quiet. The lightning stops. The skulls dissipate. The wind moves through the ash. The being that was slave Knight Gael is gone, and what remains is a body and a pool of blood that contains everything he gave. The blood of the dark soul seeps from the wound in his chest. The painter's pigment, purchased at the cost of everything he was. He kept his promise. The posture of his collapse is worth attending to. He does not fall in the sprawling, chaotic way that something overcome by external force falls. He settles. There is a quality of completion rather than defeat in the way his body comes to rest against the ash. Whatever remains of his consciousness in those final seconds, whatever last flicker of personhood persists through the dissipation of the dark soul's overwhelming pressure, it seems to know that the work is done. The mission is complete. The long watch is ended. Consider the full structure of what we have just participated in. A man who was never supposed to matter, who was issued a red hood and told his life was expendable, who survived everything a civilization spent centuries trying to use him up in, who found love in a painted world and then crossed the end of time to protect that love. This man has, in his death, created the possibility of a sanctuary for every other soul the world has decided does not matter. The condemned, at the end, condemn nothing. The expendable became the foundation. This is why the battle against Gael is the correct ending for the Dark Souls series. Not because it provides definitive answers to every question the lore has raised. It does not. And a story this rich would be cheapened by the pretense of completeness. But because it demonstrates, with the full weight of everything that came before it, the most important truth the series has been working toward, that the capacity to love, to sacrifice, to remain human in the face of systematic dehumanization, is the most powerful force the world contains. Not fire, not dark, not the accumulated soul energy of ancient gods. Love, stubborn, unreasonable, absolute love, willing to pay any price, willing to become anything necessary, willing to go to the very end of existence to keep a promise. The ash desert at the end of time is, paradoxically, the most hopeful landscape in all of Dark Souls, because it is where that truth was proven. What the Ashen One carries back to the Painted World of Ariandel is not simply a crafting material, though the game's mechanical systems present it that way. It is love made physical. It is sacrifice crystallized into substance. It is the evidence that someone went to the end of time and gave everything they had, so that a young artist could have the colors she needed to paint a home for those who had no home. But before we reach that return, we should spend some time with the painter during the years of Gael's absence. Her vigil is not a passive thing, not simply the waiting of someone who has nothing to do but watch the door. She is working. She has work to do that only she can do, and the quality of her preparation during Gael's absence tells us as much about who she is as the quest tells us about who he is. The painter received a gift at her birth, or perhaps it was developed, cultivated, earned through years of study that we are not shown. That is genuinely unprecedented. She can paint worlds. Not illustrations of worlds, not representations of worlds, but actual worlds, genuine places of existence that can be entered and inhabited and experienced as real by those who find their way into them. This is not sorcery in the conventional Dark Souls sense. It is not the manipulation of existing soul energy according to established principles, not the application of known techniques to produce predictable effects. It is creation, the kind that starts from nothing and produces something that did not previously exist. The weight of this gift is not simple. The painter understands, as she develops her art, that she is not creating paintings for aesthetic appreciation. She is creating homes. Every world she brings into being will be inhabited by real beings with real needs, beings who have nowhere else to go and who will depend entirely on the quality of what she makes for them. She cannot get it wrong. She cannot create a world that looks beautiful, but is hostile to its inhabitants. A world that serves her creative vision rather than the needs of those who will live within it. The art must be in service of the life. This responsibility shapes everything about her approach during the years of Gael's absence. She does not simply practice technique. She thinks deeply about what a world needs to be, not just what it needs to look like, to truly serve as sanctuary for the forlorn. She thinks about sustainability, about the way that previous painted worlds, including Ariandel, eventually succumb to rot and decay, and she looks for ways to build renewal rather than stasis into the foundations of what she creates. She thinks about the specific nature of forlorn souls, what they have experienced, what wounds they carry, what kinds of environments allow those wounds to slowly heal rather than fester. She is, in a very real sense, designing a therapeutic space without any of the clinical vocabulary of that concept, working from empathy and imagination and deep attention to the particular needs of the most marginalized beings in the world's order. And she is doing it alone, waiting for the one person who could provide what she needed to complete the work. Her worry for Gael during his absence is documented in her dialogue. I wonder when Uncle Gael intends his return. This is not the worry of someone who doubts his capabilities. She knows what he is capable of. She has seen it. The worry is the natural anxiety of someone who loves a person engaged in something genuinely dangerous, who knows they can do nothing to help and must simply maintain faith. The faith is not blind. It is built on years of evidence about his character. But faith built on evidence is still faith. Still the act of trusting in an outcome that you cannot control or guarantee. When the Ashen One arrives bearing the blood of the dark soul, the painter's response is complex in its simplicity. She understands immediately what she holds. My thanks, Ashen One. With this will I paint a world. There is grief in these words. Alongside the gratitude, the grief of someone who has received exactly what they asked for and knows what the receiving of it cost. The blood in her hands is Gael. It is everything he was, transformed into the material she needs. She will paint with it. And in painting with it, she will continue something he began. The painter's response is quiet. My thanks, Ashen One. With this will I paint a world. This is not the response of someone who does not understand the magnitude of what they have been given. The quietness is the quietness of someone who has been waiting for a very long time, who has spent that time preparing precisely for this moment, and who now faces it with the full weight of what it represents pressing down on them. She knows what Gael gave up. She has been thinking about it for the entire span of his absence. The words she chooses are simple because any elaboration would be insufficient, and she knows that. So she chooses the most direct possible expression of what she will do. With this, she will paint a world, not a painting. A world. The distinction matters. She is not creating an aesthetic object or a decorative space. She is creating a genuine place of existence, somewhere that will serve as real home for real beings who have nowhere else to go. Gael's blood will be the foundation of that reality, literally worked into its material substance through every brushstroke. What does this mean for the world that results? The painted worlds of dark souls, as established in the law, carry something of the creative intent and the materials used in their making. A world painted with the blood of the dark soul, with the essence of humanity's deepest spiritual inheritance, filtered through the experience of someone who loved and sacrificed and endured, will be a world infused with those qualities. Its landscape will carry within it something of Gael's dreams. Its air will contain some echo of his hope. The refuge it provides will be shaped, at the most fundamental level, by the same impulse that drove his quest, the belief that those who have no place deserve to have one, and that providing that place is worth any price. The forlorn who find their way to the new painted world may never know the specifics of what made their sanctuary possible, but they will live within a reality that was created from love and sacrifice, and perhaps some part of that will be perceptible to them, not as knowledge but as feeling, the particular quality of a place that was made not from power or pride, but from genuine care for its future inhabitants. The offer the painter makes to name the new world after the Ashen One is touching, and it acknowledges the crucial role the Ashen One played in making all of this possible. Without their willingness to face Gael, to accept the terrible responsibility of ending his suffering, to complete the final step of a mission that Gael himself could not complete, his sacrifice would have been meaningless. The blood would never have been extracted. The new world would never have been painted. But in the deepest sense, the world the painter creates will always be Gael's world. It was made for the forlorn because of his devotion to the forlorn. It was made possible by his willingness to become a vessel for the darkest and most ancient power in existence, because he loved someone whose gift could create sanctuary. It will exist and be beautiful, and provide peace to those who need it. And every moment of that peace will be the direct consequence of what he chose to do at the end of time. On his knees in the ash, giving everything, weapons and armor that pass into the Ashen One's possession, after his defeat carry this legacy forward into gameplay in the most literal way. To wield Gael's greatsword is to carry his history, the executioner's weapon, transformed by its long association with the quest for the dark soul, channeling the red skulls of absorbed humanity in the executioner's charge. This is not a tool, it is a story made material. Every swing of it is a continuation of the journey he began. To wear the slave knight set is to wear the red hood that was meant to mark its wearer as condemned and expendable, transformed by the character of the one who wore it into something that means something different now. Devotion, sacrifice, the choice to give oneself completely to what matters. Gael's story does not exist in isolation. It sits within and speaks to the entire thematic architecture of the Dark Souls series, connecting to threads that run from the earliest moments of the Age of Fire all the way to the final scene of the Ringed City DLC. Understanding those connections enriches both Gael's story and the broader narrative of the series. The most direct connection is to the furtive Pygmy and the original Dark Soul. The Pygmy made a choice at the very beginning to fragment power rather than concentrate it, to become the origin of a people rather than the ruler of a civilization, that established the basic template for the kind of self-sacrifice that Gael eventually performs. Both the Pygmy and Gael gave up personal power for collective benefit. Both chose distribution over retention, service over dominion. The soul that the Pygmy fragmented and gave to humanity is the same soul that Gael sought, consumed, and transformed into the pigment that will let the painter create a home for the very people who carry its fragments. There is a beautiful circularity here. The Dark Soul began as a gift from the furtive Pygmy to his descendants, an act of deliberate self-diminishment in service of others. It was then hoarded, contained, and suppressed by Gwyn's civilization over ages. Gael found it in its most degraded and inaccessible form, took it into himself at the cost of his own humanity, and transformed it into something that will serve once again as the foundation for a place where the bearers of its fragments can live. The Dark Soul, across its entire history, has been defined by this tension between those who try to use it to establish control and those who try to use it to create freedom. Gael is the final expression of the second impulse, and it is under his stewardship that the Dark Soul completes a kind of redemption arc, from suppressed threat to literal building material for a sanctuary. The connection to Knight Artorias from Dark Souls I, called the Abyss Walker, is worth noting. Artorias also descended into a corrupting power in an attempt to serve others. He entered the Abyss in an attempt to halt its spreading dark corruption of Ulashile, sacrificing himself for the people trapped within it. His effort failed. The Abyss consumed him before he could achieve his goal, leaving him a hollow, maddened shell of the knight he had been. His intentions were genuine, and his willingness to accept personal destruction for a larger purpose connects him to Gael in spirit, even if not in outcome. The difference, if we read both stories carefully, is telling. Artorias' sacrifice failed in part because he allowed the corruption to overwhelm him entirely, losing his original purpose in the flooding of his identity. Gael's sacrifice succeeded because, even in his most overwhelmed state, his purpose persisted at his core. The gentle humanity that remained in his soul item description is the law's way of telling us that he never fully lost himself the way Artorias did. This comparison invites a deeper question. What determines whether corruption consumes or is used? Artorias had power and intention and courage equal to, or exceeding many of the heroes the Dark Souls universe presents to us. He went into the Abyss willingly, knowing the danger. Why did it take him when Gael, consumed by something equally vast and overwhelming, managed to retain the essential core of himself? The answer, I think, lies in orientation. Artorias had a goal: stop the Abyss, but the Abyss itself had no investment in what he was trying to accomplish. When it consumed him, there was nothing in what he sought that the corrupting power resonated with. Gael had something different, a purpose oriented entirely outward, towards someone else, toward the creation of something good for others. The dark soul that corrupted him was, at its deepest level, the fragmented essence of humanity, the love and memory and longing of countless human lives across ages. When that power flooded Gael, it may have encountered something it could not entirely erase, because what he carried resonated with its own nature. This is speculative territory, and the law doesn't spell it out directly. But the soul item's insistence on that word, gentle, suggests that something of his character survived in a way that Artorius's did not. The resonance with the Ashen One's own situation is also meaningful. The Ashen One is defined by their relationship to ash and cinders, the remnant state between fire and darkness, the condition of someone who has already burned and been left with what survives the burning. Gael recognizes the Ashen One by this quality, calling them out of the crowd specifically because of what they are. There is a sense in which both Gael and the Ashen One are beings defined by what they are willing to endure. The Ashen One rises from their own ash repeatedly to continue their mission. Gael continues his quest through transformations that any reasonable being would treat as terminal. They are, in some sense, kindred spirits, people shaped by fire and continuance into instruments of change. The painted worlds themselves, as a concept, represent the most radical alternative to the fire and dark binary that has governed Dark Souls lore from the beginning. Every other proposed solution to the world's fundamental problem has operated within the terms established by Gwyn's age. Either extend the fire through linking, allow the dark to come through refusing to link, or try to reverse the world to some earlier state. The painted worlds propose something different. Exit, not victory within the existing system, but the creation of a space that the existing system's terms do not apply to. What makes this so radical is how simple it sounds in summary. The answer to the endless, exhausting cycle of fire and dark is: go somewhere the cycle doesn't reach. Don't fight for control of the flame. Don't argue about whose age should come next. Don't link or refuse or desperately patch a dying world. Paint a new one from scratch with better materials, oriented from the foundation toward the needs of those who will live there, rather than the vanity or fear of those who made it. The simplicity of the solution is part of what makes it feel like genuine wisdom rather than mere escapism. It is not a denial of the cycles that have dominated reality. Those cycles will continue in the world outside the painting, will continue grinding through their pattern of fire and dark until whatever final state they are progressing toward is reached. But the painted world is a proof of concept that this pattern is not the only possible structure for existence, that creative love and genuine sacrifice can build something outside it. Gael's quest is the enabling act of this alternative. By obtaining the pigment that allows the painter to create a genuinely new world rather than simply a patched or extended version of an existing one, he makes possible the first genuine escape from the cycles that have trapped Dark Souls' reality for all recorded history. The new world will not be subject to the alternation of fire and dark. Its inhabitants will not need to choose between linking and refusing, between the age of gods and the age of man, between any of the exhausting binary options that have defined existence until now. They will simply live. This is the ultimate significance of what Gael accomplished. He did not just help the painter. He helped create a demonstration that genuine alternatives are possible, that the cycles which have seemed absolute and inescapable are in fact only one possible structure for reality, and that the creative power of someone who works with love and sacrifice can build something outside those cycles entirely. The Dark Souls series has always been, among other things, an extended meditation on the possibility of hope in the face of overwhelming systemic despair. Every game asks whether it is possible to persist with integrity in a world that seems designed to exhaust and corrupt. The first game asks this through the framework of the undead curse and the choice to link or refuse the fire. The second asks it through cycles of repetition and the growing awareness that previous chosen undead have stood where you stand and made choices that didn't work. The third asks it through the lens of endings. Everything is ending, the embers are fading, the champions are returning to ash, and the question is whether there is any response to that ending other than desperate prolongation or passive acceptance. Gael's story is the series' final answer to that question. Yes, it is possible. It costs everything, but it is possible. The price of genuine hope, the price of creating something genuinely new rather than simply extending what exists, is everything you have and everything you are. Gael paid that price willingly and in full, with clear understanding of what it would cost, and in paying it, he created something the world did not previously contain. Proof that the cycle can be escaped, that love is a sufficient foundation for genuine creation, that the condemned and the forlorn deserve homes and can have them. In the quiet that follows the final battle, after the lightning has stopped and the red skulls have dispersed, and the waste of ash and bone has returned to its terrible stillness, there is a moment that asks something of us. It asks us to understand what we have just participated in. We did not defeat slave Knight Gael, we completed him. We were the final instrument of a purpose that he set in motion and could not conclude himself. Every blow we landed was both an act of combat and an act of compassion, a step toward the release that the corruption had made impossible for him to find on his own. We were not his enemies. We were, in the most meaningful sense, his final allies. The soul that we collect from his defeat confirms this understanding. The viscous, lukewarm lump of gentle humanity that remains at the core of his soul after the dark soul's power has been dissipated. This is what was always there. This is the person who persisted through centuries of slave night service, who found purpose in protecting a young artist, who crossed the world and the boundaries of time itself in service of love. The gentleness that the description calls out so deliberately is the gentleness of someone who never stopped caring, even when the caring cost more than most people can imagine being willing to pay. The new painted world that the painter creates with his blood will be his most lasting memorial, not a monument in stone or a name inscribed in record. The slave knights were people whose names were not supposed to be remembered, and there is something fitting about Gael's legacy taking a different form. His memorial is a living world. His monument breathes and grows and provides peace to those who need it. Every soul that finds rest in that painted sanctuary is living proof that his sacrifice achieved its purpose. But perhaps the most important thing Gael's story gives us, the thing that extends beyond the particular beauty of Dark Souls lore and speaks to something broader about being human, is the proof it provides about what love is capable of. Love in easy circumstances is not much of a proof. Caring for someone, when caring is pleasant and costless, tells you nothing very interesting about the nature of that care. What tells you something is when the caring becomes difficult, when the cost escalates beyond what anyone could reasonably expect to be paid, when every forward step requires the sacrifice of something previously considered essential. At what point, under what conditions, does love finally have limits? Gael's answer is, further than you think, further than seems possible. The man who was issued red hoods and sent into the worst battles of the worst wars, who survived what was designed to destroy him, who found home in a painted world and love in the painter's trust, who then walked into the thing that would destroy him with full foreknowledge of what it would cost. That man's love for the painter and for all the forlorn who needed her gift was not conditional on what it asked of him. It gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give, and even then it held on, as the soul description tells us, to gentleness. That is what slave Knight Gael ultimately represents. Not the grandeur of the chosen hero or the power of the divine champion, but the extraordinary thing that ordinary devotion can become when it is given without limit. He was a condemned soldier. He was cannon fodder, marked with a red hood, and sent into the dark because no one thought his life was worth preserving. He was never supposed to have a story worth telling, never supposed to leave anything behind that would outlast him. And he created a world, not through power borrowed from gods, not through destiny inscribed in prophecy, not through some inherent greatness that set him apart from the beginning. He created a world through the simple, stubborn, total act of loving someone and refusing to stop, even when stopping became the only reasonable option, even when continuation required the sacrifice of everything, even at the very end of time, when there was nothing left but ash and the echo of what had been. The red hood is no longer a mark of condemnation. It is Gael's flag, And it means something now that no institution meant it to mean when they pressed it down over the head of a soldier they did not value. That one person, however small and condemned they may seem in the eyes of those who hold power, can choose to matter, can choose to give, can choose to love in a way that outlasts them and builds something the world did not have before. That is the legacy of slave Knight Gael, and it is more than enough. Thank you for joining me tonight for this journey to the end of time and back. If Gael's story moved you even a fraction of how much it moves me, then I'm grateful for the company. These are the tales that remind us why we play, not for the mechanics or the challenge, but for the extraordinary things that happen when a story trusts its audience to sit with complexity and tragedy and beauty all at once. If you want to support more lore explorations like this one, leaving a like and subscribing means everything. It tells me you want more nights like this one, more slow dives into the stories that matter. Until next time, wanderers, may the embers guide you wherever your road leads, and may you always find, at the end of it, something worth the journey. Sleep well.